let's talk a little bit about the Jimmy Butler situation, which is never boring and never seems to get old and it's continuing
And
to hang
never
over.
ending.
Yeah, never ending for that matter. We're a couple of games into this Butler 7-game suspension, and a few things, Rachel, are beginning to crystallize. One, as I talked about a little bit on the last show, it really has become Phoenix or bust for Jimmy Butler. And the reason is pretty simple. The Phoenix Suns, if he can find his way there, are the most likely team out there to give him the 2-year, $100+ million extension that he's been looking for. So Jimmy Butler is trying to find his way to the Phoenix Suns to the point where people around him have made it clear that he doesn't want to play anywhere else. So if you're Memphis or if you're Sacramento or if you're Milwaukee, yeah, you can trade for him if you want, but he's not going to want to be there. And I think we've seen kind of how that plays out with Miami when he doesn't want to be in a certain location. The problem is that Phoenix can't do anything. Like Phoenix is so landlocked by these big contracts and so limited by where they are in the tax apron that they really can't do much. I mean, the one thing they can do is flip Bradley Beal's contract, right? But Bradley Beal, as we know, has that no trade clause, which makes him untradeable unless he signs off on that deal. And from what I was told from people close to Beal this week is that, look, would he okay a deal to another contender, Miami included? Yes. He ain't okaying a deal to like Detroit or Charlotte or any rebuilding team that's out there. He's not doing that. So putting aside the fact that the machinations are difficult in doing a deal regardless, and the fact that Miami doesn't want Bradley Beal. Like they've made that clear. Bradley Beal's got 2.5 years left on his contract. They don't want that money on their books for the next couple of years. We're kind of at a stalemate to the point where I think we're going to start talking in the next week about Jimmy Butler coming back to Miami because the Heat, historically, they're not a fan of sending players away and saying, just wait it out. We'll pay you while you're off on the sidelines. The NBA doesn't really like that either. So I get the feeling more and more, Rachel, that when we get to, next week, his suspension is up, I believe a week from Friday. So right there in that window. When we get to next week, I think we're going to be talking about Jimmy Butler back in a Miami uniform. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, look, the Bradley Beal situation in Phoenix, that's the key to this. And if Miami doesn't want him and Beal hasn't even been approached about a trade, which according to his agent, he has not, I don't see how this happens. I mean, Bradley Beal spoke after the game the other night and he said, look, I have all the cards. And unless someone addresses me, I consider myself staying here. And so he's right, by the way. He holds all the cards. And until somebody convinces him that he needs to okay this trade, it's not going to happen. And Miami, of course, would have to want the trade. And Miami is the team that said to Jimmy Butler this past spring, we're not going to extend you, right? They said for that same reason, they don't want that money on their books. So if that's the case, they don't want the Beal money on their books either. You know how excited the Washington Wizards were to get off of Bradley Beal's money? They were willing to go through what they're going through now. So that should tell you something. I mean, this is a situation with this contract that not only is an albatross in terms of the money that you've got to pay a guy who, look, Phoenix put him on the bench the other night. Is he a starter? Is he not a starter? It depends on the team, of course. He's obviously a star, but where you would use him, are you overpaying him for how you would use him? And, here's a guy who also has a no trade clause. So even if Phoenix can get it waived so that he can go to Miami, and even if Miami would want him, Miami would then be stuck with a player with a no trade clause. And I certainly don't think the Heat are looking to do that. So if you're hearing Phoenix or bust, if your sources are telling you that's it, then yeah, I would say that the likelihood is that we'll see him back in a Miami uniform. And then it's going to really be a question of, I don't know if it's Pat Riley and Jimmy sitting down. I don't know if it's Jimmy sitting down with some of the people around him. How do you want this to play out? What's the ideal here? Because Jimmy's the one who's going to hold the cards and make a decision at the end of this season. He has a player option for $52 million for one season. Let me just say that one more time. $52 million for one season for a guy who I think is going to be 36 years old at that point. And that is hard to turn down, especially if you are Jimmy Butler and you have made getting these bigger contracts a bigger and bigger priority for you over the last 5 years. That's part of this sourness with Miami, is that he does, they don't want to extend him, and he thinks he deserves that additional 2-year, $100 million plus deal. That's his issue apparently with the other teams, with the sourcing and reporting you've done, that, hey, these other teams, if they're not going to extend him, then he doesn't want it, and Phoenix would be willing to. So I just don't know if he's going to turn down an additional year at $52 million, even if it's with a team that he is at sort of cross purposes with, like Miami. And if that's the case, if he decides, you know what, at the end of the season, I'm taking the 52 mil because I'm not getting anywhere else, well, then it's not a matter of, oh, can you ride out the season being an attitude problem? You got to ride out the next year and a half. And so if you're Jimmy Butler, you have to ask yourself, are you going to make this difficult for a year and a half? Are you really prepared to dig in like that? And in a lot of ways, for who we know is a very competitive guy, kind of just give up the end of your career, because if things are going poorly internally in the team, they're not winning anything, right? So are you willing to do all of that? Or after this whole thing plays out, are you willing to suck it up and say, okay, let's work out our differences. Let's figure this out. Because it's not just a decision for when the suspension is up. It's a decision with like pretty long-term implications.
Let me ask you this. Do you think he can go back into that locker room? Because when the going got tough down there in Miami, Jimmy Butler kind of quit. We can call it, you can call it something different, but he was suspended, not just because he sat up there and said, I've lost my joy, but because the Heat didn't believe he was playing hard enough. And if the team doesn't believe that you're playing as hard as you should, you better well believe that your teammates think that too. Now, Jimmy's been through some, battles with these guys, specifically the veterans like Bam and Tyler Hero. But do you think he can go back into that locker room next week and kind of pick up where he left off?
I think that's really up to three people, right? Obviously, Jimmy Butler, what attitude he has, how he approaches things. I think that'll make a huge difference, obviously, because if it feels same old, no one's going to give him another chance. If he goes in with an attitude of, okay, I've reconsidered, I've thought about my next year and a half, I want to make this work, then it also is up to Bam Adebayo and Eric Spoelstra. Eric, as we know, just wants to win. He may be privately frustrated, annoyed, mad at Jimmy Butler, but if Jimmy can help him win and Jimmy has a good attitude and Jimmy is playing his heart out, Eric will be happy with that. And he will want Jimmy back in that locker room because Eric wants to win. Bam Adebayo, I think, does have this sort of friendship, been through the wars with Jimmy. I'm sure been very frustrated with Jimmy. Bam is essentially such a nice and good guy. You and I have spent a decent amount of time with him. He is someone who not only is very competitive and wants to win himself, but I think he wants to see the good in people. That is what I have noticed by being around Bam, by being around his mother, by being around people close to him. So I think that he is not sort of one of these guys who is sort of like, you cross me once, I will never speak to you again, sort of personalities. That's my impression. I don't, obviously we don't know what's inside someone's head, but my impression is if Bam is okay with it, if Eric wants to win and is okay with it, and if Jimmy comes in with a good attitude, I think that locker room gets fixed.
Yeah, I think what it comes down to is Pat Riley's appetite for having Butler around. I mean, Riley's had some pretty strong statements about Butler over the last 8 months, from the, shut up and play comments after last season to we're not trading him in late December to we're suspending him. He doesn't want to be here, so we'll listen to trade offers. I wonder if Pat's going to overrule everybody and say, you know what, forget him. We're not bringing him back into this mix. I don't care what anybody says. We're not bringing him back into this locker room. I'm curious to see where that goes. I agree with everything you said there. I think Spo just wants talent there, wants guys to play hard. He could make it work. Look, 2.5 years ago now, Jimmy Butler tried to fight him on the bench. They went to the conference finals that year. So they can work through a lot of stuff. I am curious to see what Riley's position on all this. Can Riley and Jimmy Butler come to some kind of working arrangement where they don't hate each other enough not to be there, where they're able to deal with, Pat can deal with the drama and still work on a trade over the next few weeks. Butler can come back, play hard, play whatever role Eric Spoelstra wants him in, and see what happens before February 6th. That's to me what I'm most curious about there with Miami.